Hey, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Are there any questions? Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the respiratory system. So your learning outcomes are to summarize the role of the respiratory system in the body, distinguish between inspiration and expiration, and identify the structures of the human respiratory system. So the respiratory system ensures that oxygen enters the body and carbon dioxide leaves the body. So during inspiration or inhalation, air moves from the atmosphere to the lungs through cavities and tubes. During expiration or exhalation, air moves from the lungs to the atmosphere via the same structures. So the respiratory system, ventilation or breathing is inspiration and expiration, and depends on the cardiovascular system to transport oxygen from the lungs to the tissues and carbon dioxide from the tissues to the lungs. So during cellular respiration, cells use up oxygen and produce carbon dioxide. So here's an image of the human respiratory tract. So we have the upper respiratory tract, which has the nasal cavity, the pharynx, the glottis, and the larynx. Then we have the lower respiratory tract, which has the trachea, the bronchus, the bronchioles, the lung, and the diaphragm. So the upper respiratory tract, you summarize the role of the nose, pharynx, and larynx in respiration, identify the structures of the upper respiratory system, and provide their function, and explain how sound is produced by the larynx. So the upper respiratory tract includes the nasal cavities, the pharynx, and the larynx. The nose opens at the nares or the nostrils, which lead to nasal cavities. The nasal cavities are separated from each other by a septum composed of bone and cartilage. Hairs filter the air and trap small particles so they don't enter air passages. So here's an image of the upper respiratory tract. So we have the nasal cavity. Then we have the pharynx, which is composed of the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. Then we have the glottis and the larynx down here. So nasal cavities are lined with the mucous membrane. The mucus helps trap particles and move them to the pharynx, which then can be swallowed or expectorated, which just means spit. Under the mucus layer is the submucosa, which contains lots of capillaries that help warm and moisten the incoming air. The abundance of capillaries makes us susceptible to nosebleeds. So the nasal cavities contain odor receptors. They also contain the tear glands in the eye drain into the nasal cavities by way of the tear ducts. So this is why crying causes a runny nose. The nasal cavities also connect with the sinuses of the skull. So fluid may accumulate in the sinuses, causing an increase in pressure or a sinus headache. So air in the nasal cavities passes into the nasopharynx, the upper portion of the pharynx. Auditory tubes or eustachian tubes connect the nasopharynx to the middle ear. When air pressure inside the middle ear equalizes with the pressure in the nasopharynx, the auditory tube opening may create a popping sensation. So the pharynx, or the throat, is a funnel-shaped cavity that connects the nasal and oral cavities to the larynx. It has three portions: the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. The tonsils are made of lymphoid tissue at the junction of the oral cavity and the pharynx, and provides defense against inhaled pathogens. The larynx is a cartilaginous structure between the pharynx and the trachea. The Adam's apple, or the laryngeal prominence, is located at the front of the neck. The larynx houses the vocal cords, which is mucosal folds supported by elastic ligaments. The slit between the vocal cords is called the glottis. When air passes through the glottis, the vocal cords vibrate, producing sound. The greater the tension in the vocal cords, the higher the pitch. When the glottis is wider, the pitch is lower, and loudness depends on the degree to which the vocal cords vibrate. So here's an image of the vocal cords. We have the base of the tongue, we have the epiglottis, and then those vocal cords, and then the glottis. Okay, so the larynx, when food is swallowed, the larynx moves upward against the epiglottis, a flap of tissue that prevents food from passing into the larynx. Okay, the lower respiratory tract. So your learning outcomes here are to summarize the role of the trachea, bronchial tree, and lungs in respiration, identify the structures of the lower respiratory system and provide their function, explain how the alveoli increase the efficiency of the respiratory system. So the lower respiratory tract includes the trachea, bronchial tree, and the lungs. The trachea, commonly called the windpipe, connects the larynx to the primary bronchi. Its walls are reinforced by C-shaped cartilaginous rings, which prevent the trachea from collapsing. The C shape allows the esophagus to expand into the trachea when swallowing. So here's an image showing you the cells lining the trachea. So you have these large goblet cells, and then you have epithelial cells that have cilia and this mucus layer, which traps particles, and then the cilia move the particles back up. Okay, the lower respiratory tract, the trachea continued, aligned with pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium and goblet cells. The goblet cells produce mucus, which trap debris from the air as it passes through the trachea. The mucus is then swept away from the lungs and towards the pharynx by the cilia. And smoking can damage the cilia, which leads to smoker's cough. And then a tracheostomy is a breathing tube insert into the trachea. In the bronchial tree, there's two primary bronchi that lead from the trachea into the lungs. The primary bronchi branch into secondary bronchi, which continue to branch until they are small bronchioles, about 1 millimeter in diameter. Bronchi have cartilage like the trachea, but as they get smaller, the cartilage disappears. Okay, the bronchial tree during an asthma attack, the smooth muscle of the bronchioles constricting it and causes wheezing. Each bronchiole leads to an elongated space enclosed by many air sacs called alveoli. So here's an image of the alveoli here, these little sacs. And just remember that red represents oxygenated blood and blue represents deoxygenated blood. Okay, so the lungs are made up of the secondary bronchi, bronchioles, and the alveoli. The right lung has 3 lobes, while the left lung has 2 lobes to make room for the heart. Each lobe is divided into lobules. Each lung is enclosed by membranes called pleurae, which secrete pleural fluid. The pleural fluid has surface tension, which adheres the parietal and visceral pleurae. Surface tension is due to hydrogen bonds between water molecules. Because of surface tension, when the thoracic cavity enlarges, the parietal pleurae pulls the visceral pleurae and therefore the lungs outward. This increases the size of the lungs. And then pleurisy is the inflammation of the pleurae, which is super painful. Okay, the alveoli. The lungs have about 300 million alveoli. Each alveolar sac is surrounded by blood capillaries. The walls of the sac and the capillaries are both made of simple squamous epithelium, and gas exchange occurs between air in the alveoli and blood in the capillaries. In the alveoli, oxygen diffuses across the alveolar wall and enters the bloodstream, and carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood into the alveoli. The alveoli are lined with surfactant, a film of lipoprotein that lowers the surface tension of water and prevents the alveoli from closing. Infant respiratory distress syndrome: when premature infants don't make enough surfactant, the alveoli collapse. So mechanisms of breathing. So your learning outcomes here are to contrast the processes of inspiration and expiration during ventilation, define the terms tidal volume, vital capacity, and residual volume in relation to ventilation, summarize the purpose of the inspiratory and expiratory reserve volumes. So ventilation has 2 phases, or breathing has 2 phases. You have inspiration, which is inhalation, moves air into the lungs, and then expiration or exhalation moves air out of the lungs. To understand ventilation, it is necessary to remember the following facts. Normally, there is a continuous column of air from the pharynx to the alveoli of the lungs. The lungs lie within the sealed thoracic cavity. There's a rib cage, top and sides of the thoracic cavity. There's intercostal muscles between the ribs. And then there's a diaphragm on the floor of the thoracic cavity. The lungs adhere to the thoracic wall by way of the pleurae. Space between the 2 pleurae is minimal, and fill the pleural fluid. A ventilation concluded. Ventilation is covered by Boyle's law, which states at a constant temperature, the pressure of a given quantity of gas is inversely proportional to its volume. So during inspiration, the active phase of ventilation, the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles contract. In its relaxed state, the diaphragm is dome-shaped. During inspiration, it contracts and becomes flattened. Contraction of the external intercostal muscles causes the rib cage to move upward and outward. Both actions increase the size of the thoracic cage. Okay, inspiration continued. As the thoracic volume increases, the lungs increase in volume as well, because the lung adheres to the wall of the thoracic cavity. As the lung volumes increase, the air pressure in the alveoli decrease. Alveolar pressure is now less than atmospheric pressure, so air flows from outside the body into the lungs. And that's sort of illustrated here. So if you can imagine you have a container, and as the size of the container move outward, the air pressure decreases, and now air moves into the container. And reversely, if the size of the container move inward, air pressure increases, and now air moves out of the container. And this is the same thing for the lungs. So as the rib cage moves up and out, the external intercostal muscles pull the ribs outward, and the diaphragm contracts and moves down. And so when pressure in the lungs decreases, air comes rushing in. Okay, so during expiration, the passive phase of breathing, the diaphragm and external intercostal muscles relax. The rib cage returns to its resting position, moving down and inward. The lungs recoil and the air pressure inside increases, air flows out. Okay, so that's shown here. So as the rib cage moves down and in, the internal intercostal muscles pull the ribs inward during forced expiration, and the diaphragm relaxes and moves up. And so when the pressure in the lungs increases, air is pushed out. Surfactant keeps the alveoli from collapsing during expiration. Also in the lungs, as the lungs recoil, the pressure between the pleurae decreases, and this keeps the alveoli open. When in an accident, the thoracic cavity is punctured, or a punctured lung, air enters the space between the two pleurae, causing the lung to collapse. So maximum inspiratory effort and forced expiration. Breathing hard or maximum inspiratory effort uses muscles of the back, chest, and neck, increases the size of the thoracic cavity more than usual, allowing maximum expansion of the lungs. So expiration can also be forced, so like singing or blowing air. So this is due to contraction of the internal intercostal muscles, forces the rib cage downward and inward. Also, when the abdominal muscles contract, they push on the abdominal organs, which push upward against the diaphragm, forcing air out. So volumes of air exchange during ventilation, you have a couple of key words here. So you have tidal volume, which is the amount of air that moves in and out with each normal breath. Then you have vital capacity, which is the maximum volume that can be moved in plus the maximum amount that can be moved out during one breath. Then we have inspiratory and expiratory reserve volume, which is the increased volume of air moving in or out of the body with forced inspiration and expiration. And so here's an image showing you how we measure the vital capacity of the lungs. So you can see during rest, we don't breathe at maximum inspiration. And then to calculate vital capacity, we add maximum inspiration plus maximum expiration. So vital capacity is the sum of tidal, inspiratory reserve, and expiratory reserve volumes. Some inhaled air never reaches the lungs. It fills the nasal cavities, the trachea, the bronchi, and the bronchioles. These passages are not used for gas exchange. They contain dead air space. And residual volume is the air remaining in the lungs after exhalation. Okay, so I think I'm going to stop there for today. Are there any questions? All right, I'll catch you guys later. Have a great day.